And we've got lights. Okay, so as a quick review of what we've covered so far, because February 9th was a long time ago, in our first lecture we looked at Murillo's career and his most important commissions, which, as you might remember, were mostly ecclesiastical patrons commissioning series for either churches or monasteries, but also for some private patrons. And we learned that he was patronized as well by elite clientele, particularly foreign merchants who had established their trade in the very bustling and port capital city of Seville. In the second lecture, we looked at Murillo's images of children and genre scenes, for which he is perhaps best known, and we'll see a little bit more of that as our lecture unfolds today. In the third lecture, we looked at Murillo as a painter of his own times in Seville, and his work supporting the contested devotions to the Immaculate Conception and to San Fernando, when we enjoyed that wonderful 80s pop ballad as well as part of that lecture. Sadly, I don't have any other 80s pop ballads that are relevant to Murillo. We'll have to look for something else. And last week we looked at Murillo as a draftsman and his founding of the Drawing Academy in Seville in 1660, as well as his self-portrait. So we saw a little bit about how Murillo saw himself as an artist. Today is our last meeting, and I want to close by highlighting Murillo's reputation in the centuries after his death in 1682. Today's lecture will be more text than usual, so we'll be reading a lot, but I hope you'll bear with me because I think it's very worthwhile to read what people had to say about Murillo outside of Spain. The career of Murillo has always been the subject of fascination in Spain, and you'll recall that we saw these two Romantic era paintings depicting imagined scenes from the career of Murillo. In the late 17th century, Murillo was the best known Spanish painter internationally. Yes, he was more famous even than Velázquez in his own century, excepting perhaps Ribera, but I don't think you can really compete with Ribera since he spent most of his career outside of Spain. So Murillo had built a truly international reputation during his lifetime and beyond. His work could be found in Flanders and England thanks to the already mentioned foreign merchants and diplomats who set up shop or visited Seville. And he was so popular that in 1779, the Conde de Floridablanca, any of you who are familiar with late 18th century Spanish history will remember that name. He's a minister to the king, Carlos III. But he had to put an export ban on Murillo's works because at the rate that Murillo was being collected in the late 18th century, there would be nothing left in Spain. But we'll see that despite those efforts, many Murillos left Spain in the decades following this ban. True enthusiasm would await, though, for the 19th century, at least outside of Spain. Spanish art, unlike Italian or Dutch and Flemish art, was kind of a late bloomer when it comes to the international demand, but the political situation in the 19th century, as well as the dawn of the Romantic era, meant that Spanish art was ripe for international recognition in this period, including perhaps especially works by Murillo. You'll recall that many of his best works are no longer in situ, and we saw that a lot over the course of the lecture series, but particularly in the first lecture. The reasons why this is will be elaborated shortly. His work also fetched the highest price ever at auction in the 1850s and was collected with unbridled enthusiasm, sometimes respectably, but more often not so respectably, which we will see. Today we will focus on the taste for Murillo in Britain, France, and America. And although we will treat each nation separately, you'll see that the development of demand for Murillo and an ebbing and flowing critical response to his work follows similar patterns in all three places. So let's start with Britain. We can see that the Romantic impulse to depict scenes from the artist's life was not exclusive to the peninsula. And we saw this work during our first lecture. And it's an imagined portrait of Murillo's early career by a Scottish artist. But it attests to the mythological status of Murillo in Great Britain And I think it also is a great example of romantic visions of Spain. There's a lot of exotic elements to this market scene that would have fueled that romantic imagination in Britain, but also in France. Seeing Spain as a place of gypsies and bandits and all sorts of marvel, which is not necessarily true, but that's the way that Spain was depicted outside of Spain in this period. Indeed, as we have already seen over the course of the lecture series, the British were quite enthusiastic about Murillo, and already in his lifetime, works were being exported to England and in many cases copied. We saw this image in our second lecture. Sometimes the copies were so good that they passed as originals for a very long time, and only recently this picture in the National Gallery of the boy drinking had the attribution changed. It was originally thought to be by Murillo, but now, at least according to the National Gallery, it's attributed as style of Murillo and thought to be an 18th century copy, but a very good one. Many times, there were second-rate copies, though, produced of Murillo's works, and as the demand for Murillo increased, these second-rate copies were passed off as the real thing and sold on the market. And when we read critical responses to Murillo, especially ones that are negative, sometimes from this period we have to ask ourselves whether what they were looking at was the real thing, or what they were looking at was a terrible copy. So it's always good to take those sorts of texts with a grain of salt. Most popular in England, though, were his genre scenes, whose popularity was such that we know images were widely disseminated, whether via copies but also prints. And we saw these two pictures were transformed into wallpaper for Victorian homes in the second lecture, which is one of the most fun uses of Murillo. We should probably sell this in the gift shop here at the Meadows Museum. But not only were they popular in the Victorian era, these genre scenes, but they were popular long before and collected avidly in Britain. And they held a great influence on British artists. And we can see this most clearly in the work of Gainsborough, who you probably know from his fabulous portraits, but he was also famous, perhaps even more famous in his own lifetime, for what were termed in the period these fancy pictures. They were pictures of peasant children in rustic settings, and they drew inspiration directly from Murillo, a debt that was acknowledged by his contemporaries. So when a contemporary viewer in the 1780s would look at these works by Gainsborough, they would know immediately that he's quoting from Murillo. And we know that actually Gainsborough owned works by Murillo, such as the John the Baptist, whose attribution is a little bit contested, but we know that this picture was in Gainsborough's own collection of paintings. And he purchased it in 1786 after the death of Richard Cumberland, who was an English playwright and diplomat who had been in Spain and brought the picture back to England in 1781. We also saw last week that artists like Hogarth were influenced by Murillo's self-portrait. It was tremendously influential abroad, and it was known both because it left the peninsula at an early date, but also because it was copied in prints, and the image was widely distributed. And this portrait served as a point of departure for the British 18th century painter and satirist William Hogarth's charmingly named portrait, The Painter and His Pug, and that he chose Murillo as a model for his own self-portrait, which of course a self-portrait by an artist is an assertion of identity as an artist, I think is a very great testament to Murillo's esteem among British artists in this period. The taste really starts to ramp up at the turn of the 19th century. Murillo was in very high demand among English collectors, but always with English taste. And I have two little snippets from William Buchanan, who was an art dealer in England. And these are instructions to his agent on the continent. In a letter of about a year back, you mentioned the subject of 4 of the Murillos, but not of the other 2. He is a master in great repute in this country, and therefore I think the whole 6 might be sent home, unless any of them are crucifixions or martyrdom subjects or the like. So in very Protestant England, those too Catholic pictures, it can be a little Catholic, maybe like a virgin, but not too Catholic. People don't like to see death in their drawing rooms or dining rooms. The people of England don't give their money to be made melancholy. And you can see that Murillo, as we've talked about over and over again in this lecture series, his style was so sweet and his coloring was so masterful that he was really appreciated for his style. So even though he was a Catholic painter, maybe he was not as Catholic as Zurbarán, who paints more, there's less of a monastic quality to Murillo's work. So that could explain why he was so much more popular in England. Additionally, Murillo was supremely popular among those who were not in the art world, who were not professional dealers like Buchanan, or artists or critics, artists like Gainsborough or Hogarth. To choose just one of it, there are so many examples, textual examples of enthusiasm for Murillo in this period in England and the rest of Great Britain. And I just wanted to choose one example of a name you might recognize. I'm sure most of you know the name Benjamin Disraeli. And he visited Spain and sent many letters back to his family members, to his mother, sister, and we'll see what he has to say about Murillo on his visits. And I've just chosen two examples, but he mentions Murillo more than half a dozen times in his letters, as at least the published letters that I looked at. This is one. Oh, wonderful Spain, think of this romantic land covered with Moorish ruins and full of Murillo. And again, this is playing directly into that romantic vision of Spain as this very much other, this place apart. It's like leaving Europe. I think that there's a French quote from the period that says that Africa begins at the Pyrenees. And there's a lot of the Black legend to be read into certain things, into this type of vision of Spain, but I don't think that there is a nefarious intent necessarily in this more picturesque approach. But it's important to keep all of those things in mind when reading material like this. This is a longer passage. Seville, and again, who could blame him for associating Seville with Murillo, as we've seen the artist and his native city are completely intertwined. But Disraeli visited Seville in July. Can you imagine how hot it must be? And no air conditioning available in the 1830s, but that didn't put him off. Seville is full of Murillo, who appears to me the most original of artists. In London, we think of him only as the painter of beggar boys, because we happen to possess the only picture of this kind that he ever produced. No man has painted more or oftener reached the ideal. He never fails. Where can his bad pictures be? I constantly ask. All here and every house and church are full of chefs-d'oeuvre. We have found here a most agreeable, and that is not a typo, that is his typo, not mine, friend in Mr. Williams, an English merchant. And I just wanted to keep the letter going to give you an idea of the color of what kind of English people are in Seville in this period. An English merchant who married to a Spanish lady, considered the greatest connoisseur in paintings in Spain. He has nearly 30 of the finest Murillos. It is astonishing with what kindness he behaves to us. His house is open to us at all times, and we pass our evenings most agreeably sitting in his patio, turning over the original drawings of Murillo while his Spanish sister-in-law Dolores sings a bolero. So he's getting the full experience there. I'm surprised it doesn't go on to talk about sherry, but maybe I just didn't read that part of the letter. He was quite smitten with Murillo, as you can see, and this is a reaction shared with many other northern travelers to the peninsula in this period. And this is remarkable too, considering, as we'll see, that by 1830, when he's writing, many of Murillo's best pictures had already been carted off. Not only did Murillo influence painters, but I just wanted to show you an example that he influenced other artists working in other media, and at this point, photography is absolutely a cutting-edge medium. This is a Swedish-born but a British photographer, and it's an interesting example. that illustrates, again, that Murillo's influence was very broad. And the enigmatic nature of these types of images and the image in Fort Worth, we talked about at length in the second lecture. But I think that the sweetness is taken away in terms of the influence of this picture. And none of the, I don't read any of the potentially nefarious undertones that we might read in the genre scenes in this photograph. So he was beloved in Britain, but of course he was not universally acclaimed. And I don't want to give you the sense that everybody who ever saw Murillo in the 19th century absolutely loved him. So there are plenty of critics, and I don't think it's worthwhile to review them all. Just one will suffice to give you a sense of the fact that the taste for Murillo was not always positive. Let's see, John Ruskin, whose name you might recognize if you've ever studied 19th century art. He was the leading art critic of the English Victorian age. He liked Murillo fine at first, and we'll see here, or maybe kind of tepidly. It is true that his virgins are never such goddess mothers as those of Correggio or Raphael, but they are never vulgar. They are mortal, but into their mortal features is cast such a light of holy loveliness, such a beauty of sweet soul, such an unfathomable love, as renders them occasionally no unworthy rivals of the imagination of the higher masters. So Ruskin liked him fine, but then he has a pretty severe change of heart. And this is 1836. Now we're almost 10 years later in 1844. Again, talking about Murillo, his drawing is free, but not ungraceful, but most imperfect and slurred. He doesn't like painterly painting, apparently. Slurred to gain a melting quality of color. That color is agreeable because it has no force or severity, but it is morbid, sunless, and untrue. His expression is sweet but shallow. His models amiable but vulgar and mindless. Remember, he just said the virgins weren't vulgar. I guess he has a short memory. His chiaroscuro, commonplace, opaque, and conventional, and yet all this so agreeably combined and animated by a species of waxwork life that it is sure to catch everybody who has not either very high feeling or strong love of truth, and to keep them from obtaining either. So not only is he insulting Murillo, but he's insulting any of us who happen to like Murillo. So I hope that that includes everyone in this room after these 4.5 hours of lectures. But again, this is just to show that the acclaim was not universal, but the demand for Murillo and the avid collecting of his work cannot be denied, even in the face of critics like Ruskin. Let's turn to what the French thought of Murillo. He was popular during his lifetime and in the immediate decades afterwards in England, but in France, the Murillo craze took a little longer to catch on. But when it did, it caught on like a house on fire. The history of the popularity of Spanish art in France could be a lecture series, probably, all into itself. And if anyone wants to know more about the taste for Spanish art in France, I'm happy to talk with you after and recommend some sources that you could read to learn more, because it actually is quite a fascinating subject. But today I'm just going to hit the highlights as they relate to Murillo and give you a taste. In France, in particular, the political and historical climate of the early 19th century paved the way for an influx of Spanish art. But that's not to say that nobody in 18th century France knew who Murillo was. And as a matter of fact, we know that Louis XVI bought 2 Murillos in 1782. One is a Holy Family that was known as the Vierge de Seville, and another is this young beggar, which we have seen several times over the course of this lecture series. It's quite an iconic work. And then increasing French interest in Spain and Spanish art were 2 publications of picturesque views of Spain in France. Most importantly, the first one on the left, the Voyage Pittoresque, which was published in several volumes, but also this book that included printed printed copies of Spanish painting. So it very much increased interest for French travelers, but also for French connoisseurs in Spanish art. But they were relatively rare in French collections until the Peninsular War. And this is a subject with which you're probably all familiar, and I chose a print by the British satirist Gilray, which I think he has some of the best. The New Yorker cartoonists today have nothing on him. If you look, he's quite a fascinating figure. But you can see here the British, I think this is supposed to be Pitt, and then Napoleon, of course, you can see he has to kind of edge out of his chair to reach. But you see they're carving up, as part of these wars, they're carving up the world, the globe for themselves, each taking a rather fat piece. And you can see Napoleon is trying to take all of Europe off with him. So this is interesting that they divided up Europe, but they also divided up the artistic patrimony of Spain. In England, this isn't to say it was only the French who were taking pictures out of Spain in the early 19th century. We do, the most iconic example of English collection in this way is the Duke of Wellington, who took no fewer than 165 paintings, including a dozen Murillos that he had intercepted from Joseph Bonaparte. And they're now in Apsley House, which is a fabulous museum in London. If you ever are there, I highly encourage you to visit. And just to note, our own painting, the Jacob painting upstairs, left Spain as a result of the war, along with the other paintings in the Jacob series and other very famous works, such as the Rokeby Venus, Velázquez's only female nude, that's now in the National Gallery. They were carted off, though, by George Augustus Wallace. But the French were the main, and he's an Englishman, but the French were the main beneficiaries of the chaos. We all know this print because the Meadows has several impressions, including a working proof, and there was an exhibition curated by Edward Payne, a focused exhibition on this print a few years ago from his Disasters series, and my caption seems to have disappeared, but Goya's disasters illustrate the absolute carnage inflicted on Spain in the early 19th century as a result of the French occupation and the Peninsular War. But I think it's also worthy of our attention from an art historical perspective to consider the artistic carnage of the Peninsular War, which meant a mass exodus of paintings from Spain at the beginning of the 19th century. French troops took hundreds of works from Spain to France, and a recent figure that I read numbered them 999 paintings. It's too bad they couldn't have just taken one more. So we could say hundreds, and instead of hundreds, we could say 1,000. But they took really good things. And this systematic looting was part of the national ethos. And I'm not trying to blame the French. This was a worldview that was shared by pretty much every colonizer in this period. And even today, perhaps. Think of the Elgin marbles as a great example. But they considered taking these works kind of to be the result of altruistic motives. The French Republic, on account of its strength, the superiority of its intellectuals and its artists, is the only country in the world that can provide a secure exile for these masterpieces. So we're really doing you a favor by looting your churches because you couldn't possibly take good care of them yourselves. And again, yes, this still goes on today. But most important name to remember in this context is one, and that's this fellow, Jean de Dieu Sous, who was a marshal general, and he was the commander of French troops in Andalusia, and he is the quintessential picture looter. All in all, he took 180 paintings from Andalusia, but mainly in Seville, for his own personal collection, among them 20 of Murillo's very best works, such as the Immaculate Conception, which we still know as the Sous Madonna, right? His name is associated with this painting, even though, as we've learned, it was returned to the Spanish in an accord between the Vichy government in France and General Franco in Spain. And it was actually handed over on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, which is quite an interesting historical detail and rather symbolic, I think. And I also think, just to illustrate a bit of his character, Sue bragged to an English writer named Richard Ford that this virgin saved the lives of 2 people. We hear about virgins miraculously saving lives, but what Sue meant in this case was the virgin saved the 2 lives of the men in the Hospital de los Venerables, who he didn't have to shoot because they didn't put up a fight when he took the picture off the wall. So just to give you, again, an idea of what kind of man we're dealing with. He took the choicest pictures from Murillo's other major commissions, not only this fabulous Immaculate Conception, but you'll also remember when we looked at his major series, such as his series for Santa Maria la Blanca. Remember I showed you they, as part of the Año de Murillo celebrations, they painted copies of these 2 works that are being installed in the church. Well, that's because he took the originals. And his collection was auctioned off, so that's why not all of them remain in France. But yes, he took these. And you'll remember at La Caridad, I showed you this slide where only the green pictures are original and the red are copies of the works that were taken away by Sue. And I guess the silver lining of this is that some of Murillo's very best works are more easily available to us than if they had remained in situ, such as this picture in the National Gallery in Washington, which we looked at closely and is just a masterpiece of color and painterly style, but also this one, also from the Caridad in the other National Gallery in London. Again, a fabulous picture. He had help picking the cream of the crop, and ironically, the recent publications in Spanish art history at this time, such as Thean Bermúdez's famous biographical dictionary of Spanish artists published in 1800, served as a church-by-church and site-by-site guide to their looting enterprise. So back in France, the Marshal's collection at his home on the Rue de l'Université became the de facto Spanish gallery in the French capital and was visited by artists for study, including artists like Delacroix, who thought the collection was spectacular. And I have a quote here. "I was talking to De La Roche one day about Marshal Sue's wonderful Murillos, and he was willing to allow me to marvel at them." So the pictures that Sue brought back to Paris made quite the splash. But the most important milestone in the history of French demand for Spanish art is the Galerie Espagnole, a name you might be familiar with, which was formed by, back to that. I guess I probably just put that in there because we can never get enough. But Louis Philippe, the king of the French, of the July monarchy, you might be familiar from 19th century history. He reigned from 1830 to 1848, but he organized a Spanish gallery. He sent a man called Baron Taylor to Spain in 1835 as his agent to purchase paintings, and he formed an official state-sponsored Spanish gallery. This practice may seem to us like spoliation today, but it was not seen to be problematic at the time, and in fact, it gained praise both at home and abroad. And here we see an English admirer of Louis Philippe's enterprise. With a munificence truly regal and that cannot fail of gratifying such a nation as the French, the king appropriated $1.5 million francs, about 60,000 pounds sterling, right? And this is 1837, so that's quite the sum, out of his own private purse to the purpose of forming a gallery of Spanish pictures. Baron Taylor traversed the peninsula in every direction, exposed not only to many inconveniences, but even dangers from the state of warfare. For his ardor in the pursuit of his object would not allow him to avoid any place where fine works of art were to be found. And he ultimately succeeded in transporting to France 450 choice specimens of Spanish paintings. When will our government take such a step to enrich the arts of this country. Why might not England have made this collection? So they're just upset that they didn't think of it first, I suppose. The gallery, Louis Philippe's gallery, opened to the public 3 years after Taylor was sent to Spain, and it opened on January 7th, 1838. 5 rooms and unfortunately I couldn't find a reproduction of the hang for the slide, so you'll just have to use your imaginations. But 5 rooms at the Louvre were set aside for the purpose, holding over 500 works, and 40 of them were given to Murillo. Just over half are actually identifiable today. 19 were given to Velázquez and 82 to Zurbarán. So it was open for 11 years to the public, and it fueled a craze for Spanish painting and romantic imaginings about Spain. And the literature and art produced as a result of this and the critical response is absolutely fascinating. So I highly encourage you to read about this on your own time. But artists in the generation of Courbet and Manet were tremendously influenced by what they saw at Louis Philippe's Gallery Espagnole. An iconic example from Manet is his Spanish singer that's now in the Met, which was actually his debut at the 1861 Salon, and it made quite the splash, playing right into the taste for Spain and Spanish subjects at the time in France. And the influence of Murillo is not obvious here. Manet was more of a fan of Velázquez, who he called, of course, the painter of painters. But in works like this, we might perceive the influence of Murillo, such as works like this that we know were in France, of his Beggar Boy. Louis abdicated in 1848 and left for exile, and the gallery was dissolved and auctioned off in London in May of 1853. So I suppose the British did get their chance to collect their own Gallery Espagnole at that time. And in the same period, in 1852, Seuss' collection sold at auction in Paris. So by the later 1850s in Paris, there is not as much Spanish painting available. So you can see why it was much more influential for this mid-century painters than for later 19th century painters. Let's see, now let's talk more about, this is not a mistake that she's there. She ties Sue and Louis Philippe's gallery together. She, of course, is the most iconic and famous of all of Murillo's 24 Inmaculadas, and you know he painted some beautiful ones, as we saw a few weeks ago. You might recall that it was commissioned by Justino de Neve, who is Murillo's friend and patron, in 1678 for an altarpiece at his recently founded Hospital de los Venerables, which was a home for retired priests. After bringing the picture home to Paris, he proceeded to try and make a mint off the painting, offering it for the staggering price of 250,000 francs in 1823 via William Buchanan, who's the same dealer that we saw earlier in the lecture, who didn't want anything too Catholic. And again, he tried in 1835 to sell it to Louis Philippe for his Gallery Espagnole for 500,000 francs. But he was unsuccessful. The deal ultimately fell through. The Louvre did finally purchase the picture in 1852 at the auction of Seuss' collection. And of course, this is 4 years after the gallery dissolved, as I mentioned. And this auction with this work was most of you probably saw the news about the Leonardo painting from last year, his Salvator Mundi, that caught the largest gross price at auction for any single painting. Well, this was that work in the 1850s. It drew in a whopping 615,000 francs at auction, the highest price ever paid for a picture up until then. Competing bidders included the Russian Tsar, Queen Isabella II of Spain, and the National Gallery London, whose price ceiling of £5,000 didn't cut it. And when it was won by the Louvre, it was hung, and I'm just bringing back in detail so you can appreciate why it was so in demand and why it's still so famous today as his best Inmaculada. but you can see that when it was brought to the Louvre, it was given pride of place, hung in the Salon Carré alongside works by Veronese, Raphael, Leonardo, Rubens, and Van Dyck. This incredible salon-style installation is immortalized in this 1861 painting. And you can see here is our Murillo. She looks rather small when you've got this above, but she's hung right where everyone can see her and appreciate her coloring. Her beauty was elegized by the likes of Balzac and Zola, and the work was incessantly copied by artists, and in particular, female artists, which is quite interesting given that the work being done on the Wikipedia Feminist Art History editathon that's going on in the next room here at the Meadows today. But through the latter half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the work was incessantly copied. It's so much so that the act of copying the work has been immortalized in this painting, which is now in a private collection. But here you see a female artist at the Louvre copying Murillo, and we can see exactly what she's copying. We can see the Sous Immaculate Conception there. We can see the birth of the Virgin that's still in the Louvre here. And of course, the young beggar, or also known as urchin hunting fleas. This act of copying was an important part of artistic training in this period, copying after the masters. And as a matter of fact, if you go to any major museum today, you can still see artists copying in the galleries. But this incessant copying, of course, led to influence, and I think a clear influence from Murillo can be seen in this 1845 painting of a chimney sweep. It's indebted to Murillo both in terms of its palette and deep shadows. But copying, as I said, was a fundamental part of artistic practice and training in the period, and thanks to the records at the Louvre and the fact that a copyist would have to get permission from the museum and register as a copyist, which I suppose you don't want anyone running around next to your paintings with wet paint, so you do have to kind of screen who you're letting into the galleries for that purpose. So thanks to the records, we know exactly what works were being copied. In the 1850s, and surprise, surprise, Murillo was by leaps and bounds the most requested artist on record at the Louvre by copyists. The Sous Immaculate Conception alone was requested to be copied 167 times in less than 5 years. Half of these requests came on its first year on display. It was that popular. The Beggar Boy was the second most popular, with 124 requests. And to illustrate the frenzied popularity of Murillo in this period, we need only compare his copies, and his requests totaled 597, to the next most requested artist, who was Velázquez, who brought in 97 total requests for copies. Still lower is Ribera's 38 requests, and worse yet are the Italians. The Mona Lisa only received 50 requests to be copied. Again, 597 requests to copy Murillo. His popularity in 19th century France was staggering. I'd like to close more briefly with a discussion of his reputation in America. The first firmly attributed work to reach the US was his Caritas Romana, which was exhibited in Philadelphia in 1816, and it was exhibited for nearly 30 years at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and thankfully for me, I don't have to put it up because it was destroyed in a fire. And any of you who are familiar with the iconography of the Caritas Romana, which is a common subject in painting, will know why I'm grateful that I don't have to put it up on the screen. Closer to home, Four Figures on a Step was from the Kimball, was exhibited in the US at a very early date, shown in New York in 1830, which won much critical praise. And we can see the sales catalog. The coloring is equal to any master that ever painted, and the whole possesses a force and excellence which only requires to be seen to be appreciated. And we can see it anytime we like if we just hop on I-30. And then American travelers in the second half of the 19th century were aided by the publication of travel guidebooks in English, such as Sterling Maxwell's and Edmund Head's, both published in 1848. But travel to Spain was always romanticized, as I've mentioned time and again today, and the dangers were exaggerated. And I have a quote again from our friend Richard Ford, the English writer: "Influenced more by the asceticals than by the aestheticals of Spain, the dread of bandits, oil, and garlic." And you'll remember when Victoria Beckham was forced to live in Madrid with her husband when he played for the Spanish soccer team. She said, "I'm so glad to leave. This whole place smells like garlic." I like the smell of garlic, so I'm happy to be a Hispanist. But has been stronger with picture fanciers than the love for Zurbarán, Murillo, and Velázquez. But in American artists, for an American artist's perspective on the importance of Murillo, the best illustration is this imagined exhibition gallery at the Louvre by Samuel Morse, which was a massive painting he completed while on a 3-year study trip to Paris. You'll recognize the name Morse because this is the same Morse who invented the telegraph and Morse code. But he started out as a painter. His goal in producing this work was to curate his own imaginary gallery. I have pictures from after its recent cleaning, but I couldn't find a high-resolution image from after the cleaning, so you'll have to look at it before the cleaning when we're looking at the whole. And then here we've got a little bit better, but it was cropped in. His goal in producing this work was to curate his own imaginary gallery. So keep in mind that the Louvre was never hung this way. But he went around the galleries, picking his favorite works from the outstanding collection and meticulously copied them. And he was almost like a tourist destination in and of himself, running around with scaffolding, because when things are hung salon style, if you want to copy them, you really have to get up there to be able to access the paintings. And this picture toured the US after it was recently restored and came to the Amon Carter a couple of years ago, so some of you may have gotten the chance to see it in person. Morse himself had high hopes of touring the painting around the country and making profit off of showing it and exhibiting it, but luckily for the history of technology, if not the history of art, it fell a little flat, so he focused his efforts instead on things like the telegraph and the Morse code. So I suppose it's good that he didn't win critical success. But what's interesting for us is that among the paintings on the wall in his imagined perfect gallery, you'll recognize that he chooses to give pride of place to 2 of Murillo's paintings. And these, of course, are the ones acquired by Louis XVI. And again, my detail is from the pre-restoration photos, so that's why it looks muddy. But you'll see this is the Holy Family at this point called the Virgin of Seville. And this is the Beggar Boy. And he put them in his painting. His goal was to educate an American audience on the history of art in an era before photographic reproduction was widely available. So this type of thing would be intended as an American audience's first introduction to all the greats of art history. This is all to remind you that the critical misfortune of Murillo in the 20th century, again, I've mentioned probably ad nauseum, that he's thought to be too soft or sweet, too devout, not serious enough of a painter, is largely a result of changing tastes. He was almost too popular in the 19th century, and the 20th century's pendulum had to swing in the other direction. There's a quote that I'd like to bring us to a close with from an art historian called Carl Justi, who is a German turn-of-the-century art historian. And I think the quote is as relevant today as it was 120 years ago. It has lately become fashionable to depreciate Murillo in contrast with Velázquez, particularly in reaction against his popularity with the layman, and partly on technical and artistic grounds. It appears to us that neither reason is justified. The 2 masters should not be compared. The one holds the mirror to nature and his period. The other shows what lies behind the brow. So that's what Justi had to say. And in our own galleries upstairs, we can piece together the history of the Murillo craze I'm sure that this audience is very familiar with the research done on Justa and Rufina by our late curator Nicole Otzbach, which it was bought by the Rothschilds in the 1870s and looted by the Nazis in World War II. It's a very familiar story, time and again over the centuries, trying to put together a universal museum, which is what the French were doing in the early 19th century, trying to put together the Napoleonic Museum, comprehensive museum. And most important for us today is to think about this Christ on the cross on copper. It's a cabinet picture, and the reason why it's the most important is because we're going to look at it upstairs when we finish. And it was one of Murillo's first works documented to leave the peninsula, if not the first. We don't know exactly which work left first, but it left at a very early date after it was painted. And we know that it was taken to Flanders by the Marqués de Rodriguez, Devora y Vega. So his name could be Spanish or Portuguese. And he was a nobleman who married into a prestigious Flemish noble family, the Steenhuisen family. And any of you speak Dutch? Then you can't correct my pronunciation, which I'm sure is awful. But anyway, it remained in that collection until auction at 1860 in Paris, but it retains its original frame and the seals from the Steenhuisen family on the back. So look closely at the front, because we can't see the front upstairs. We'll have to look at the back. But it is a very finely painted picture. And I think it's fascinating to think about works painted on metal, on copper, and most other artists who paint on copper approach it with a very small brush, making it almost, like there's a series of archangels upstairs, and there's almost a jewel-like quality, but Murillo retains his painterly style even in such a small scale on such an unusual medium. So I'm gonna now, I did finish perfectly on time. So I'm gonna ask you to ask any questions, and then we're gonna go upstairs. So thank you. Yes.